When The Mandalorian premiered, it did not announce itself as a reinvention, yet it quietly redrew the boundaries of what Star Wars storytelling could sustain. For the first time in decades, the galaxy was not framed around prophecy, bloodlines, or the gravitational pull of the Skywalker saga. Instead, the story opened on survival, work, and consequence. This shift was not cosmetic, it was philosophical. By removing destiny from the center, the series allowed choice, failure, and restraint to matter again. Proving that Star Wars could function without the Skywalkers was its most radical achievement, precisely because it did not make a spectacle of that absence. The show did not reject legacy characters out of hostility, but out of confidence. It trusted that the galaxy itself was enough, that ordinary lives shaped by imperial collapse and moral ambiguity could carry narrative weight. This confidence reframed Star Wars as a setting, rather than a single family saga. The result was a universe that felt open again, rather than recursively self-referential. By stepping away from galactic destiny, the story reintroduced uncertainty. Din Djarin is not chosen, foretold, or spiritually significant. He survives because he adapts, compromises, and occasionally gets lucky. This grounded approach restores tension because outcomes are no longer guaranteed by mythic alignment. When survival is the goal, instead of balance of the force, every decision carries risk. Star Wars becomes dramatic again not because of scale, but because of vulnerability. Scale itself is recalibrated with remarkable precision. The Mandalorian tells small stories, but those stories make the galaxy feel larger. Quiet planets, nameless towns, and temporary alliances suggest vastness through implication rather than exposition. Instead of constantly reminding the audience of galactic stakes, the show lets the edges remain undefined. This negative space invites imagination, making the universe feel expansive rather than overcrowded. Small jobs matter because they contextualize power. Bounties, transport runs, and protection work reveal how ordinary people navigate the aftermath of imperial rule. The Empire is no longer an abstract evil, it is a lingering scar that shapes economies and fears. These modest stakes anchor the setting in lived experience. By focusing on what happens far from the Senate chambers and superweapons, the show restores texture to the galaxy. Tone becomes the primary storytelling engine. Silence is allowed to linger. Scenes breathe rather than rush towards spectacle. Music underscores mood instead of dictating emotion. This restraint marks a deliberate departure from the maximalist tendencies of recent Star Wars entries. Action still exists, but it is framed as interruption rather than constant escalation. The galaxy feels contemplative, dangerous, and lonely, which aligns more closely with its original frontier DNA. Atmosphere replaces exposition as the dominant language. We learn who Din is not through speeches, but through rituals, pauses, and refusals. The helmet rule is not explained philosophically, it is enforced socially. This trust in visual and behavioural storytelling signals maturity. The show assumes the audience can infer meaning rather than needing it spelled out. That assumption deepens immersion and restores a sense of mystery long absent from the franchise. The lived-in quality of The Mandalorian is perhaps its most immediately felt contribution. Cantinas feel occupied rather than decorated. Backwater worlds look functional instead of pristine. People have routines, grudges, and survival strategies. This aesthetic resists the theme park polish that had begun to dominate Star Wars visuals. Dirt, wear, and improvisation return as narrative signals of authenticity. Morally grey characters populate these spaces naturally. Allies are temporary. Motivations are mixed. Help often comes at a cost. This ambiguity grounds the story in consequence rather than alignment. The galaxy no longer sorts itself cleanly into heroes and villains, but into people responding to pressure. That complexity allows tension to arise from interaction rather than ideology. The re-emergence of Western and samurai influences completes this reframing. Lone gunslinger ethics replace cosmic obsession. Honor is personal rather than institutional. Violence is restrained, purposeful, and often regretted. Din Djarin echoes wandering Ronin and frontier mercenaries not because of homage, but because the narrative structure supports that lineage. The story breathes in the same rhythm as those genres. emphasizing solitude, codes, and quiet resolve. This genre grounding stabilizes the tone in ways epic mythology cannot. Westerns and samurai films are about borders, transitions, and the cost of survival in lawless spaces. Those themes map naturally onto a post-imperial galaxy struggling to define itself. By leaning into these roots, The Mandalorian reconnects Star Wars to storytelling traditions that value mood and character over spectacle. The result feels timeless rather than reactive. Importantly, the show does not announce these influences with self-awareness. It does not wink at the audience or over-explain its inspirations. It simply inhabits them. This confidence allows the tone to remain consistent and unforced. The Mandalorian trusts its aesthetic instincts, and that trust translates into coherence. Every choice feels aligned with a singular vision rather than a checklist of franchise expectations. The child functions as an emotional anchor rather than a lore delivery system. His presence introduces care, responsibility, and restraint without immediate explanation. Mystery is allowed to exist without urgency. This patience is rare in modern franchise storytelling, which often rushes to monetize revelation. By resisting that impulse, the show demonstrates that withholding information can be more powerful than constant disclosure. Taken together, these choices reframe what Star Wars can prioritize. Legacy becomes optional, scale becomes flexible, tone becomes foundational. The galaxy feels large not because it is constantly displayed, but because it is selectively revealed. The Mandalorian succeeds by narrowing its focus and trusting atmosphere over amplification. In doing so, it quietly resets audience expectations. Yet this very success introduces new pressures because a working formula invites replication. What begins as a corrective risks becoming a template. The same restraint that made the show feel expansive can be diluted when copied without intention. And as the franchise absorbs these lessons, it begins to wrestle with how success reshapes creative instincts across multiple projects. The influence of The Mandalorian does not end with its own narrative success. It radiates outward and begins to reshape the franchise creative instincts almost immediately. What started as a deliberate narrowing of focus becomes, paradoxically, a new centre of gravity. Lucasfilm recognizes that audiences responded not to escalation, but to restraint. Episodic pacing, personal stakes, and atmospheric storytelling are no longer experiments. They are signals to be replicated. In this way, The Mandalorian changes Star Wars DNA by proving a quieter approach can carry commercial and cultural weight. That proof becomes a template. Mission of the Week structures spread across subsequent shows, emphasizing contained objectives and serialized character moments. This format offers accessibility, flexibility, and lower narrative risk, which makes it attractive for a sprawling franchise. However, repetition without reinvention carries its own danger. When every story adopts the same rhythm, restraint loses its power to surprise. What once felt refreshing begins to feel procedural. Side quests work because they reveal character under pressure, but when overused, they can substitute motion for meaning. The Mandalorian succeeds because each detour reinforces Din values, boundaries, or evolving sense of responsibility. Later projects sometimes mistake movement for development, assuming that constant activity equals depth. The result is a galaxy that travels frequently, but arrives rarely. The structure remains intact, but the purpose erodes. Success also accelerates overexpansion. Spin-offs multiply faster than thematic clarity can keep pace. Characters once defined by mystery are quickly slotted into interconnected timelines, crossovers, and narrative obligations. What was once a vast galaxy begins to feel crowded by familiar faces. The Mandalorian opens space, but the franchise rushes to fill it, often too quickly and too completely. This overpopulation has a compressing effect. Instead of expanding the universe, constant interconnection shrinks it. Events feel prearranged, encounters feel inevitable, and coincidence replaces chance. The sense of a lived-in galaxy gives way to a carefully managed network of appearances. The Mandalorian worked because it felt like one story among many, not the hub around which all others rotated. Mystery is another casualty of replication. The child resonated because he was not immediately explained. His origins, abilities, and significance unfolded slowly, and sometimes not at all. This patience invited speculation without demanding resolution. It trusted the audience to sit with uncertainty. Later projects often treat mystery as a temporary marketing tool, rather than a narrative posture, rushing to answers that flatten rather than enrich the story. When mystery becomes merely a setup for reveals, its emotional impact diminishes. Answers arrive before curiosity has matured. Lore replaces experience. The child mattered because he was a presence, before he was an explanation. When that balance is lost, characters risk becoming delivery mechanisms for information, rather than anchors for emotion. The franchise forgets that not knowing can be more powerful than knowing. Cameos further complicate this shift. In The Mandalorian, familiar figures appear sparingly and with narrative intent. Their presence feels earned, contextual, and consequential. As the template spreads, cameos begin to substitute for development. Recognition becomes shorthand for meaning. Emotional response is outsourced to memory rather than built through story. This reliance on nostalgia creates diminishing returns. Each appearance must escalate to feel impactful, crowding the narrative with references that compete for attention. Consequences soften because characters exist beyond the immediate story, protected by future obligations. Stakes blur when outcomes feel reversible or predetermined by brand continuity. The Mandalorian avoided this trap by keeping its focus narrow and its world porous rather than enclosed. Yet the show also demonstrates what restraint makes possible when honoured. Its best moments are quiet decisions, not loud confrontations. Din choosing to protect the child, choosing to remove the helmet, choosing to let go. These moments land because the story slows down enough to let them breathe. They remind the franchise that emotional weight comes from pause as much as action. Restraint, however, is difficult to scale. It requires discipline, trust, and a willingness to leave money and spectacle on the table. As more projects chase the Mandalorian's success, fewer are willing to commit to its limitations. Volume replaces focus. Noise replaces atmosphere. The lesson is learned superficially, but ignored structurally. The irony is that The Mandalorian proves Star Wars feels biggest when it is quietest. A single campfire conversation can suggest more history than an entire battle. A lonely outpost can imply 1,000 untold stories. When the franchise forgets this, it compensates with escalation, making everything louder and smaller at the same time. The galaxy becomes dense with content, but thin with meaning. This tension defines the post-Mandalorian era of Star Wars. The show opens a door, but the franchise struggles with how many stories should walk through it, and how quickly. Restraint is harder to monetize than expansion, but it is far more effective at sustaining wonder. The Mandalorian succeeds not because it answers what Star Wars is, but because it reminds audiences how Star Wars can feel. Ultimately, the series reframes the franchise relationship with scale, tone, and legacy. It proves that Star Wars does not need constant mythic reinforcement to matter. It needs texture, patience, and room to breathe. When those qualities are present, the galaxy feels infinite. When they are ignored, it collapses inward, no matter how many stars are on screen. The lasting lesson is simple but demanding. Star Wars thrives when it resists the urge to explain, connect, and amplify everything at once. The Mandalorian demonstrates that less can carry more, silence can speak louder, and restraint can generate awe. Whether the franchise continues to honour that lesson will determine whether it keeps feeling vast or merely busy.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.